Very hard to have a two-income family because you're moving around so much, and so the spouse or partner has a hard time, forging a career, making a job, and debt is a huge problem and a huge suicide risk. We have in combat zones a huge scandal about traumatic brain injury. The Pentagon ordered helmets, but neglected to make sure the helmets fit right. The Pentagon ordered earplugs from 3M, but neglected to make sure the earplugs worked right. And then we have the toxic waste dumps that produce the PACT Act, where Kellogg, Brown and Root, who still remains a military contractor, Vietnam, Kellogg, Brown and Root was known as Burn and Loot, or Bribe and Lie. And they had a contract for waste disposal and essentially used, 15th century waste disposal methods of 24/7 burn pits, which produced the PACT Act, which was long sought after legislation to help people with toxic exposures in a number of different areas, from World War II into the Middle East. And so, one of the things I think people don't understand is that VA patients are very different from patients, other patients that are seen in private sector exam rooms. The average person over 65 has 3 to 5 presenting problems. The average Vietnam vet has 9 to 12. My friend Kevin Miller, who was in Iraq, who went to his doctor when he was 30, was told he had the body of a 60-year-old, and he had 16 different presenting problems, 16. And so the VA is really important because of, a lot of doctors that I've spoken to think of patients and patients and patients. We want to do our bit for vets, but they don't understand the complex problems that veterans have. They don't understand about military culture. They don't understand about the civilian-military divide, which has been widened, I would argue, into a chasm because of the end of the draft and so forth. And one of the things that has been so important in this election, and that is important, is that we have a very serious effort, and Jasper will talk more about that, and Steve, to privatize the nation's largest healthcare system, right? A healthcare system that specializes in veteran problems, because guess what? You only care about, if you're treating 9 million, 6 million vets a year, decade after decade after decade, you kind of, get to know veterans as patients. It's a population health system, right? And veterans have very specific problems. They also have a target in the VA that they have forced to be accountable in many instances, right? PTSD, Agent Orange, the VA and Congress didn't say, oh, wow, we have this problem, let's throw money at it and doctors and nurses at it. They were forced, kicking and screaming sometimes, by veterans groups and advocacy groups, like just happened with the PACT Act. And they want to privatize this system. And tragically, we write about this in our book and our articles, this is a actually bipartisan movement, we would argue. It's not just Republicans, it's Democrats that want to privatize it. And so what's at stake in this election, I think, and in the next 2 years for the Democrats, is, in our view, we feel that the Democrats have frittered away, in some sense, 2 years on pursuing, and there's maybe people in the audience who will disagree, and we'd love to hear from them, some Trump-era policies that we feel they could have acted more assertively to reverse. But in the next 2 years, there's an opportunity to really reverse those policies. The Human Resource Modernization Project that has crippled VA hiring. Some of the recommendations the Secretary made for the Air Commission, there's just a whole lot of things, and we're concerned that these policies need to be reversed. I want to give a shout out to AFGE and the National Nurses Union, United, and other unions and veterans groups that really acted, I think, to end the Air Commission. And the point that I think we want to make it, if there is a new agenda for Veterans Affairs, it's going to come from grassroots alliances, grassroots organizing. There's a huge threat of privatization, like there's a threat of Medicare privatization. We have been speaking to healthcare reform groups, and there was a huge victory in our view against seating this Air Commission that was stacked again with very heavily with corporate with representatives of corporate interests and privatizing interests, and that AFG took the lead in that, but that was also NNU and many other veterans groups. I mean, it was an amazing mobilization. I mean, we got the New York City City Council, to hold hearings on some of these recommendations. And whatever happens in American politics happens because we organize and put pressure on our congressional leaders, right? And we need to continue that, and we need to talk about what a new agenda for Veterans Affairs is, but also, we can have the best agenda in the world, but we have to make that agenda happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Jasper, and we'll continue.
Does this work? Yeah. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Jasper Craven. I'm one of the co-authors of the book. Just to follow up on what Suzanne said, I think that a lot of what I've focused on when it comes to veterans issues over the last few years is the sort of shifting dynamics of veteran power in Washington. Really what we've seen as the veteran population has declined is a similar sort of decline in the political power of traditional veterans groups like the American Legion and the VFW. You'll see fewer veterans serving in Congress, and I think that those trends have resulted in fairly profound policy changes that often can threaten this incredibly robust social safety net that many generations of veterans have built through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. I think that it's clear that there is still an incredible amount of political power that veterans hold, and there's a lot of really interesting energy happening right now in the veteran space. Whether you look at groups like Common Defense, which is being represented today, Naveed's here, or Minority Veterans of America. When this fight for the PACT Act was playing out, I was just incredibly heartened to see older veterans groups and newer ones come together and really push lawmakers to get this bill across the finish line. I mean, this included, a number of vets sleeping out on the steps of the Capitol, which I think was a really, just powerful, potent way to, keep the sort of pressure on to get this legislation across the finish line. However, if you look at the sort of long arc here, I think that there are also some warning signs. One great example in my research for the book was in 1977, there was a proposal on the table to relegate the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee to subcommittee status. And as soon as the major VSOs heard about this proposal, the VFW, the Legion, organizations that have and still have a pretty incredible sort of logistical infrastructure across the country, sent out the message to the post level and said, call up your lawmakers and tell them not to do this. We need to keep the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee as a major prominent body on Capitol Hill. Over the next couple of days, vets from these groups jammed the Capitol switchboard, and almost immediately that proposal was taken off the table. With some of the more recent fights, you have influential veterans service organizations and labor and other, groups that really sort of have the veterans' interests front of mind, but you're also seeing other ideological and corporate interests in the mix. In the 4 years after the VA Choice Act was passed, which was sort of this compromise legislation that reinforced the VA in some important ways, but also cracked open the door pretty significantly to the outsourcing of care to the private sector. In the 4 years after that, donations to members of the Senate and House Veterans Affairs Committee from corporate interests doubled to around $10 million. At the same time, a lot of veterans groups, old and new guard veterans groups that were struggling financially, turned in some cases to corporate healthcare interests for support. That created, and I would argue still creates, some internal tension over how these groups operate. There's also an incredibly powerful ideological force on the right that is hell-bent on dismantling the VA and sort of finding anecdotes that it can use to denigrate the system. And the sort of most powerful group here is probably Concerned Veterans for America, which is a Koch-backed organization that was quite pivotal in actually sort of building a narrative around this wait time scandal that emerged in 2014 that led to Choice. They just had so much money and were able to really conduct a full court press through the media, through lobbying, to pass that law, as well as the Mission Act, which was sort of a more permanent and extreme version of that, which, in addition to outsourcing care, also really gutted labor protections from frontline VA staff. So, there's still this sort of adage or belief in Washington that veterans policy making is the last vestige of bipartisan cooperation, and politics doesn't sort of play into these decisions. And I think that, in many cases, on many bills, there is still some pretty impressive and heartening bipartisanship that exists. But I think it's foolish to ignore the fact that this policymaking space is being infiltrated by outside interests. And I think if you look, at the history of veterans policymaking, part of the reason why this incredible slate of benefits is available is because the special interests were groups that had the veterans' interests at the top. There was no profit motive. There was no ideological motive. It was an incredible grassroots network where issues at the bottom would move to the top, and that would influence legislation. One final little example I'll give now, and I won't get into all of the details of it, but as Paul Sullivan, a Veterans Benefits Administration guru here, has told me a million times, to get into the front door of the VA to care and benefits, you often have to go through the VBA, the Veterans Benefit Administration, and file a disability claim. And just about five or 7 years ago, there were 10,000 accredited agents at groups like the VSO, or at the major VSOs like the Legion and the VFW, who helped veterans for free to craft these claims, to deal with the sort of bureaucracy inside VA to get them approved. And that number has basically shrunk to around 5,000, 6,000 coaches in recent years. And you've seen in this vacuum, as these groups sort of lose influence and lose money and lose staffers, this whole new industry blossom of for-profit claims companies that some of whom are likely violating the law and are charging veterans, tens of thousands of dollars for help that is often subpar to what the VSOs offered, and is just egregiously expensive. And so you just sort of see similar trends on so many different elements of veteran life, veterans benefits. Obviously, the for-profit colleges is another example. Places like University of Phoenix, et cetera. And a lot of this is explored in the book. But I guess sort of what I would say to conclude is that the makeup of Congress is important, elections are incredibly important, but unfortunately I think that the policy-making space itself is becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. So with that, I'll pass it on to Steve.
Thank you, Jasper. I think we should applaud my co-authors for their time management discipline. I've never heard my spouse of 42 years, Suzanne Gordon, speak for only 10 minutes, and Jasper weighed in, I think, at 8 or 9. So my job as a timekeeper was made much easier as a result. And let's see how well I do keeping my own remarks very brief, because we are in a room here today with the real subject matter experts in the field of Veterans Affairs, folks that we relied on heavily for interviews, for recommended reading, for leads and contacts, and we want to hear from them as quickly as possible. As Gabrielle said, my name is Steve Early. I am not a veteran. I'm not even until fairly recently a full-time journalist and book writer, like my two esteemed colleagues. The full extent of my military experience was 1 semester in the Reserve Officer Training Program, Middlebury College, 1 semester in the fall of 1967, and it was a formative experience, but I think not in the way that the Army hoped and intended. I did much better transitioning after college to the labor movement than to the armed forces. And my contribution to the book really is trying to bring a labor perspective to the topic of Veterans Affairs. We have an academic press, so I would point out that there is a lot of intersectionality between labor issues and veterans issues. And Suzanne and Jasper flagged some of those. Being in the military is a job. There's all kinds of workplace hazards associated with it. And there's 1 million out of the 19 million veterans in the US who are still working. They've left the military and they are trade union members. And one of the things we highlight in the book is the importance of unions paying more attention to these 1 million members in their ranks who've served in the military and who come to trade union movements, in my experience, with tremendous useful skills. 50 years ago this month, here in Washington, an insurgency, a reform movement, a movement for union democracy in the United Mine Workers was led by 3 veterans. A veteran of that struggle was not a veteran. Brother Steve Shapiro was here today, was UMW member, a coal miner for 10 years, but that whole union democracy struggle, the Miners for Democracy, 50 years ago was led by a veteran of World War II, Arnold Miller, veteran of the Korean War, Harry Patrick, a veteran of the Vietnam War, Cecil Roberts, who is still today the president of the UMW. And those multi-generational labor activists coming out of the military into a union that was corrupt, that was undemocratic, that wasn't dealing with the workplace hazards of the coal industry, which were many, became catalysts for a exemplary grassroots rank and file union reform movement. You know, in the book we talk about the role that our friend Tony Mazzocchi, a World War II veteran, survivor of the Battle of the Bulge, played later on as a leader of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. Just a couple of quick examples that we highlight in the book. Veterans bring militants, they bring a tradition of discipline and working as part of a team. They're very good at picketing. Where does the term picket come from originally? So my own experience working with a lot of vets in the labor movement got me interested in this whole overlap between labor and veterans issues, and I'm proud to report that my own union of 40 years, the Communication Workers of America, has been engaged in the last couple of years in a very productive partnership with Common Defense, a younger veterans organization. We have a great young leader of it here today, Naveen Shah, and they work together on something called the Veterans Organizing Institutes, a training program for members of CWA and other unions who've been in the military, are now looking to improve their skills as workplace organizers, political activists, community organizers, And we need more of those kinds of partnerships between unions and veterans organizations. Very quickly, my take on the VA, learning more about it from reading Suzanne's two earlier books, which I helped with a bit, this is something that needs to be defended because it's a model workers' comp system. Most people don't think of the VA as a workers' comp system, but if you ever tried to help an injured worker or a sick worker file a claim in a state workers' comp program, as bad as the VBA is as a portal to the Veterans Health Administration and the Veterans Healthcare System, overall, the VA, for people who have service-related conditions, are much better off than their civilian worker counterparts who get hurt on the job, get sick on the job, and have to file a state workers' comp claim. So it's an enormous strength of the program that is often not noted. We were able to write about this a couple of years ago for Brother John Russo's wonderful Working Class Perspectives blog, and more recently, I think, tried to reference it in some writing, book-related writing we did for Russell Mokhiber, who's here. He's got a great new publication called Capitol Hill Citizen. The other thing that attracted me as a veteran labor activist to the VA is for many years, my day job was wrangling with employers about the terms of job-related health coverage, bargaining about job-related insurance coverage. I can tell you, from 30 years of union bargaining, strikes, contract campaigns about this, it's a nightmare. And it made me, very quickly, many years ago, into a single-payer advocate, an advocate of Medicare for all. We need to sever the connection between a person's job, their healthcare coverage, should be cradle to grave, model on Canada, UK, any kind of system where you don't have to fight employer by employer for affordable health care. So here you have a system serving 9 million veterans, should be covering all 19 million veterans. That's a pretty good model of single payer. It's our best working model of socialized medicine. And if it is undermined and dismantled and defunded, we describe those threats in the book, the larger healthcare reform movement, which my union and others have invested many years in trying to build and push in a single-payer direction, will be set back as well. So it's another very important overlap. So let me just conclude by saying that the parallel threats of incremental privatization of the VA and a second federal government employer, very big employer of veterans, the post office, is something that we really need to rally a lot more veterans, their organizations, members of the public who are served by these two important institutions, the VA and the Postal Service. Between them, they employ over 200,000 veterans. They're heavily unionized. It's a way that former members of the military can continue to serve their country, continue to serve their community, and we need to publicize the fact that members of the American Federation of Government Employees, the postal workers, National Nurses United, face very parallel threats to these two major federal agencies that several 100,000 veterans depend on for stable employment, for good benefits, pensions, job rights, and all of those things are at risk if this administration does not reverse course and abandon the Trump privatization policies that threaten both the VA, both the Postal Service, and the thousands of union members and their families who depend on employment in both those federal government agencies. So I want to stop there. Hopefully I didn't run over too long, but nobody was keeping time on me. All right, let's open it up. We have plenty of time here for questions, statements, reports from the front lines of these anti-privatization struggles. I know we have several AFG folks in the room. I'll start calling on people just like in law school if people are shy, and I know the people in this room are not shy.
Richard, you want to?
Selected. Well, first off, I'm Richard Loeb. I'm a senior counsel at the American Federation of Government Employees. I want to thank our co-authors, and I would ask everyone to applaud them both for their presentation, but more importantly for their latest contribution to the field. AFG, the American Federation of Government Employees, is the largest federal employee labor union. We represent about 300,000 employees at the Department of Veterans Affairs, which has about 400,000 employees, so about 3/4 of the workforce. I'm here really to discuss the whole concept of privatization, because AFGE, and more specifically me, in my many decades in the government before I retired and came over to AFG, worked as a lawyer on government contracting. And on the government contracting front, a lot of things have come together which basically have made for a perfect storm of privatization. They include things that people really don't oftentimes think about. We've heard discussions of the Trump laws, particularly the Mission Act and other things like that, which are very crude and nasty laws designed to take away labor rights of people who work at the VA, but also to break up, most importantly for veterans, to break up their access to health care at the VA. Basically an attack on public health care, and it's important to keep in mind that the VA is the largest integrated public health care system in the country. So it spends about $100 billion a year on providing veterans health care. Well, so why so much private sector interest in breaking up the VA? Well, some of it, as some of our speakers have said, is focused on ideology. The private sector can always do it better. But people tend to be more practical than ideology. They focus on, where's the money? And $100 billion is a lot of money, and particularly in the context of other outsourcing of government functions. So hope you're keeping an eye on me. When I hit 5 minutes, knock me off. Do a hook. But what we've had for the last what we've had for the last 30 years, going back to the sort of the beginning, or at least to the maturation of the neoliberal movement began in the 1990s in a big way, has been outsourcing of government services. I mean, and in an enormous way. Just to give you some sense of the outsourcing, it is estimated now that there are about 2.1 million federal employees, excluding the Postal Service. How many private sector service contractors? I'm not talking about the contractors who build planes and ships and the things that you think of as defense spending. I'm talking about service contractors. Well, we can't really tell you the exact number because contractors fight getting those numbers because they don't want us to know what the number is. But the estimates that exist range from a low of 3.7 million to a high of 7.6 million. So I'm willing to settle on 5 million, which is more than twice the size of the actual federal workforce. And this excludes, every one of these figures excludes grant-funded positions. This is just government contracts, generally speaking to private sector profit-making organizations. How did this come about? Well, it came about through attempts to keep the size of the government smaller, or appear smaller, when in fact the scope and the mission of the government have grown so tremendously. We have fewer government employees on the payroll today than we did in 1968, when the population was 200 million. That gives you some sense of how much outsourcing has gone on. That was coupled with a tremendous loosening of the government contracting rules in the 1990s under President Clinton. So you combine outsourcing, a pressure to outsource, you combine $100 billion in spending with very, very loose contracting rules, which I have had some opportunity to discuss with our panelists, and they're just so loose now as to be virtual giveaways. You also combine that with general corporatization of medical industry, medical care. I just had a friend ask me to check out at some doctors for them. Every one of them now works for a corporation of one sort or another. I mean, it's just stunning how medical care has been corporatized. I mean, doctors don't particularly like it themselves. They complain about it perhaps more than anybody else. But you combine all these factors, and it puts enormous strain on the continued viability of the VA, and certainly on the VA as one of the outstanding medical organizations, for lack of a better term, that is still in public hands. Now, how long that will remain, I don't know. I could go on, but I'm sure I'm coming up on my deadline, and I'd be happy, like as all our panels would, to answer any specific questions you may have. So thank you, Steve.
All right, we have some, in the book we have 2 chapters. One's called the Old Veteran Service Organizations, the old VSOs, and there's a chapter on the new VSOs, and we have folks in the audience here today who have been, generationally speaking, part of veteran service organizations, and we'd like to hear from some of them. Steve, Kayla, Naveed,
Well,
Paul.
why don't we start with Steve?
Well, I don't like being called old.
Why are you referring to the organization?
Okay.
It is 100 years old.
You want to turn to? or come
This
up-
is Steve Robertson, the American Legion for many years, as legislative director, former staff director, Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, still an active Legion member in Virginia, and our key source for our book.
Well, first of all, I'm not speaking on behalf of the American Legion or my local American Legion post. Can I take the mask
Yes,
off?
sure.
That's probably the hardest task I'll have today. I am not speaking on behalf of the American Legion or my American Legion post in Stafford, Virginia. But I will tell you that I've been a member of the American Legion for 41 continuous years. I started with the American Legion Legislative Division in 1989. That's when the VA healthcare system was a inpatient, hospital-based healthcare system. And there was only about 2.5 million veterans that were eligible to even go to the VA. They were in 3 priority groups, A, B, and C. A being service-connected disabled. Even if you were 0%, you were eligible to go in. Then there were the economically disadvantaged veterans. That was the second group, priority B. Priority C was everybody else. Everybody else couldn't get in the door. So as we moved forward, the big goal was to try to get more veterans into the system, because it, in my opinion, was the VA healthcare system is a national resource. A lot of the medical discoveries and advancements came through the VA, through their research. I don't know if you remember the Seattle Foot, the prosthetic device. That was a VA product. That revolutionized prosthetics for years to come. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder occurred in the 1980s. We know that that's been around forever, both in the private as well as in the military community. But it wasn't a clinical diagnosis until the VA was able to make that happen. Dr. Friedman did a great job on that. So, you know, the VA has always been a resource. The thing that has bothered me over the years, the American Legion, the VFW, Disabled American Veterans, those were all federally chartered organizations. We have to account to Congress. We have to do an annual report to Congress on everything we do, all the lobbying activities we do, donations, everything has to be given to Congress so they can give oversight. But then all of a sudden we began to get other organizations that, you know, their policies on how they come up with positions wasn't necessarily, in the Legion, it's from the ground up. Posts submit resolutions and they said this is what we ought to be fighting for. But the newer organizations, I wasn't really sure about their structure. I sure as hell didn't know where their funding was coming from. And it really bothered me because I could see that it was kind of a little cancer that was growing. And yes, they may have been veterans that were speaking, but Lloyd Benson from Texas made the great statement, I know the difference between grassroots and AstroTurf in the form of lobbying. That AstroTurf is very shallow and really doesn't represent the average veteran. That was a big concern of mine as the Concerned Veterans for America came along. I knew some of these people because I knew that they had worked at the VA. And it was kind of disheartening to me to hear them coming out against the policies of the VA. Now, the American Legion, the VFW, and DAV, we all had reasons to question things that the VA were doing. But when Ken Kaiser came on board under the Clinton's administration and began to shift from a hospital-based system to a community-based outpatient program, that was a game breaker. It really gave us an opportunity to do eligibility reform where all veterans were able to enroll to go to the VA healthcare system. And it basically was a blessing in disguise for many of us. Moving forward over the years, the incident in Phoenix, Arizona with the wait list that ultimately led to the Veterans Choice option. I was working on the Veterans Affairs Committee at the time, and I wasn't in favor of it. I saw it as getting the camel's nose under the tent. When the original legislation was written, it had very limited restrictions on who could actually have access to the system. And what was ironic, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs already had the authority to do that. It was up to him. He could send a veteran to a local community hospital if there wasn't any services available for the veteran in his local community. That was about the time that I started retiring, and I retired completely in 2016. But I began to watch what was happening with grave concern. I appreciate my friendship with Suzanne and Steve, and them keeping me kind of abreast of what was going on. I think it's time that the veterans community needs to refocus on the missions of the VA and get back to the basics. The whole idea of outsourcing, that was a Rumsfeld idea, by the way, in the Department of Defense. He outsourced everything from KP used to be the best punishment you could give a GI for not behaving, but now it's contracted out to the lowest bidder, and the whole outsourcing within the VA system is really troubling. I'd be willing to bet you 85% of the people that I knew that worked in the VA healthcare system said that the reason they worked there is because they loved veterans. I have never met anybody in the private health care system that says, I love patients. Most of them say, they're back. In the VA healthcare system, they say, where have you been? They missed you. So as far as I really am looking forward to reading the book, but I'm really concerned about the direction forward, because the VA is a national resource. The research that we do, the quality of care we deal with, the issues that we deal with that the private sector wouldn't deal with. Gulf War illness is a classic example. Nobody in the private sector said, oh, please come, let us do the research. It was basically in-house. DOD was denying it, PA was denying it. But the veteran service organizations were key in making sure that attention was paid to that condition. And from day one, I think burn pits was at the top of the list of what we thought might be a cause for the Gulf War illness. I hope that's ample for...
Okay. Naveed? Oh, that's okay.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Naveed Shah. I'm the political director of Common Defense. We're a progressive grassroots veterans organization. In agreement with a lot of what has already been said, I think one thing that we haven't talked about as much is the dwindling population of veterans is going to be a significant challenge for us here in the near future. It's a good thing that we have somewhat ended these forever wars over the past 20 years, and we're not creating more veterans. The veteran community has an aging population, and more, unlike in the past with groups like the Legion and the VFW that had outposts, the veteran community, especially the younger folks, are not congregating the way we used to. Sure, there are spaces online that people meet, and those have been really useful especially during the pandemic. But what we're finding is our veteran community is becoming more and more disparate, and they're less connected than they ever were before. And so, we see some of the symptoms of that with rising, suicide rates and other mental health issues for folks. So I think this is a really, like you said, a really good opportunity for veterans organizations, both legacy groups as well as the younger organizations that are coming together now, to pull our community back together. We had a huge win with the PACT Act, and that's something that when I was a young LA way back in 2012, that was one of the first pieces of legislation that I ever touched. And to see that come to fruition 10 years later was enormous. We're not going to have a win every decade like that again, but I think what we need to do is ensure that the smaller wins are better communicated to our community, that our veterans are better engaged with the issues, writ large, and we're also addressing issues at the local level. We know that a lot of policy can be made here in DC, but what happens at your local VA, what happens at your local state-run veterans clinics will have a much bigger impact on your community and your veteran members than anything else. So I'm really excited about this opportunity for all of us to continue to work together, and I'm looking forward to all the things we accomplish. Thank you.
Time for a quick commercial break, and thank you. We have not recognized the finest independent bookstore, I know there are many, in DC, Busboys and Poets, represented in the back here with copies of our veterans. So if you're a DC person, definitely check out one of Busboys' many outlets now. And if you're here today, books are available in the back. Okay, we have some other great subject matter experts here. Kayla Williams on women's issues at the VA, Paul Sullivan, who's worked on PACT Act implementation and many other issues over the years, as part of Veterans for Common Sense, and now a steering committee member of Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. I think we've had too many men speak so far. Kayla, would you like to say a few words about your great work at the VA? And a fellow author, by the way, 2 wonderful books that are high up in our bibliography, which everyone should also purchase.
You're very kind. Thank you so much. I think I wanted to pose a couple questions for y'all. I mean, you're the experts who are here, and so I'm not going to be long-winded. One of the things that I wanted to see if any or all of you would expound on a bit, I was speaking at a Veterans Day event, and the topic of the Civ-Mil divide came up, which you mentioned, Suzanne.
The topic of,
The Civ-Mil divide.
oh yes, I'm sorry.
It came up, and one of the audience members said, well, why does that matter? And, I care about it quite a bit, and I'm often in rooms where military folks and veterans are talking to each other about how concerned we are about it. And when a civilian said, well, why should I care about this divide? I fumbled a bit on how to answer that. I had a lot of things to say about how I think it matters when it comes to Congress and their ability to do really good oversight. But what does it matter that members of the general public may not understand veterans? And I'd love to hear you talk about that. I have thoughts, but you're civilians, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts on why it matters to you. And then I think the other thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, especially hearing some of the historic context of the move towards CBOX and as we think about the shrinking veteran population and how the veteran population is moving, is, how should we, the people, the government, the VA, how should the royal we move towards serving the shrinking and moving population of veterans more effectively and closer to where they are, absent something like the Air Commission that would have had a single settled plan that in theory would have driven a move towards congressional funding to make dramatic changes. In the absence of that, how do we shift from a situation where we still do have some hospitals that are a little older, more designed for inpatient, in places where there are going to be fewer and fewer veterans and lacks of spaces in places with a growing number of veterans. How do we get the will to invest in the infrastructure changes that are necessary to best serve the changing veteran population? So those are my 2 questions for you.
I want
Very
to,
good question.
those are super questions. I don't know if I,
Yeah, I would just use that.
oh, all right, so I'm going to make that go away. Because I don't, those are such great questions, Kayla. I mean, we should, we could talk for hours about them. I love your question about the civilian-military divide. Why does it count? I mean, it certainly counts for us as authors or as writers about veterans issues. Because, everybody's like, thank you for your service, but nobody really cares, I think. Or it's not that they don't care, I think they know, right? They think they know, like everybody I know thinks that all 19 million veterans have access to VA healthcare and education. You mean they don't? Really? How amazing is that? So kind of like the ignorance, in their ignorance, they assume a tremendous amount of, they assume answers to questions that are the wrong answers, right? How can they don't know anything about the VA. They don't know anything about, what, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Rotary clubs, which is like a very weird place for me to be, but I spent a lot of time in Rotary clubs because I did a guide to how Rotary clubs could help, the VA. And you talk to all these Rotarians who are into service, and they know zero about veterans, and zero, but they want to help a veteran, right? They kind of, I call it the pet vet phenomenon. They want to give Steve Robertson a raincoat and feel really good about themselves because they gave Steve Robertson a raincoat, but they don't understand that, like, maybe if they paid their taxes, there'd be more money and we could, give to a system like the VA. I mean, I think the civilian-military divide also is enormously critical in the sense of for veterans, because I think that, often one of the traumas of war and a symptom almost of post-traumatic stress disorders, you feel that nobody can understand you but a person who has gone through your exact experience, which means that the only therapist who can understand me is, somebody whose mother grew up in Poland and whose family was killed by the Holocaust, and Kayla could never understand me because, and I think that we need to erase those kinds of invidious ideas, because, the amazing thing about human beings is that, yes, I can't experience ever what Kayla experienced, but I can, if Kayla talks to me, try to understand what she experienced. And so I think that, but people have to be interested and curious about each other. So I think the civilian-military divide matters because, veterans, and this is the line I always use, veterans have served, they volunteered to serve their country. No matter what we think of the war or wherever they served or the U.S. military, they volunteered to serve us, and we have to pay attention to them, but they have to also pay attention, to sort of us. I think I want to give this to my co-authors, but I do want to say that I think Kayla's question about the Air Commission, I think that some of the impulse of the Air Commission was obviously very good. I think the problem is that the proposals were poorly developed based on flawed research, and I think that we need to have the VA serve not just veterans, but veterans communities and veterans families, and we need to really expand VA healthcare under its fourth mission. And I think that when you look at the disaster that is the American healthcare system, right? I mean, there was just an article in the Boston Globe about patients not only having to wait 3 days on a gurney in Mass General Hospital, but actually critically ill people going home, right, and giving up. I mean, the idea that we would close any VA ER, that we would close any VA hospital, I think these hospitals need to be open to all veterans, to their communities and families, and under the fourth mission, to all of us. And I think that that's where we should be going. I think I'm going to give it to Steve or Jasmine.
I'll just say something quick. Yeah. I mean, just on the civilian-military divide, I think for me as a civilian, I grew up as the son of hippies, and my dad was incredibly involved in the anti-war movement during Vietnam. And something that he really sort of made me aware of as a kid was that, like, the popular conception, there's this incredibly powerful image of what a veteran is that I think is overly simplistic. It's often sort of like a strong white male who is pretty like hoorah, go to the sound of the gunfire, all that sort of stuff. And he in his activism was able to just see like this community as far more complex and diverse, and in many ways like not fundamentally different than his own identity. I think part of the problem and part of the reason that the civilian-military divide is so important is that we, as a culture and a country, are so fundamentally defined by militarism. It has seeped into so many elements of culture. I wrote a piece last year about military schools in America, beyond sort of the major service academies, and you sort of realize that like military schooling has influenced public education, and you look at the economies in local economies. I grew up in rural Vermont. Almost every congressional district has folks working on some sort of, equipment to serve the Pentagon. Obviously in popular culture, in books, in films, the service members are often leading roles. There's this incredibly powerful and persistent image. And I think a lot of people sort of think that they don't really need to engage with veterans in real life because they're constantly fed all of these images, and they're like, oh, I get it. They're either like, a strong, tough guy, or they're mentally broken and they're hopeless and they're whatever. And so the truth is just far more complicated than that. And, if you sort of assume those things, I think there's also like political coding that is associated with those things, and I think that can drive political division. Can drive radicalization, and so just like engaging with these people and listening to them is really important, and trying to understand the work that they have done on behalf of you and the dollars you pay is really important. The final thing I would also add is that I think coming from the left, there can be a lot of skepticism about what a veteran believes, and a lot of cynicism as well. But I have just been genuinely inspired over the last 5 years covering this beat, because I had never really met people before who were so genuinely hopeful and selfless and mission oriented. And I know that that's sort of part of the image that is spun, and obviously not every veteran holds those ideals, but I have just been and bravery too, because oftentimes we're writing about people are coming forward to bring issues to light, they're risking their careers, they're risking retaliation, and it's just been incredibly heartening to see that sort of dedication and civic commitment exists. And with groups like the Legion or the VFW on the local level, and many others as well, that civic social fabric is incredibly important, and oftentimes veterans are still leading that sort of work. And so just to connect with them is really important to create a wider social fabric, an inclusive social fabric.
Suzanne?
Richard, could we come back to you?
Gabrielle was going to say
I was
something.
just going to say
Sure.
something about the military-civilian divide. I am actually someone who has had straddled the military-civilian divide. My father served in Vietnam. He was a chief master sergeant, served at Cam Ranh Bay in South Vietnam from 1966 to 1968. Came home in 1968 after, as he put it, was threatened with a second tour of duty. He decided he was able to retire. He had been in the military since the end of World War II. He retired. PTSD was not PTSD at that time. It was shell shock. And so I understood my father, the military veteran who went on to work at the post office, who transitioned into the Philadelphia public school system as a teacher. I understood it as shell shock and spent my childhood and adolescence watching this person try and deal with that. Mostly successfully, if you call watching a lot of TV and watching World War II movies successful. I guess he was successful. But trying to understand that and trying to understand how he grappled with that by talking to the couple of other veterans in the neighborhood, not talking to us about it, but did not talk to the family about it. So how was I as a civilian, as a child, trying to figure this out? Personally, what I did many years later, I decided that I was going to do my master's thesis on the Vietnam War. And I did a study of Lyndon Johnson's advisors, his informal advisors, his kitchen cabinet, who came and talked to him about Vietnam, and finally got him to, convinced him that the war was not going to be won the way he thought it was going to be won, and to wind it down. Now, I say all that, it's in part an educational exercise that American society has not done with its veterans. Remember civics education? It's pretty much gone away. What my interpretation of what needs to happen to bridge that divide is that we need to have these connections with veterans. One way to do that is to get veterans in the classroom to talk about their experiences. I was able to make some connection because I made the effort to study the history and to understand. As soon as I started studying, as soon as I started reading things they carried, and they were soldiers once and young, I got it. I understood what my father went through. Reading Lyndon Johnson's, kind of decision-making process, and I understood why we were in the fix we were in. But it's kind of up to us as a society to make our younger people aware, and people who don't have the family experiences, to bridge that gap. Because I'm constantly telling people, well, PTSD is a real thing, okay, that families of veterans have to grapple with. And this is what it can look like this, or it can look like that. And so I tell people who say, oh, veterans, you got to be careful. We used to have a saying in our neighborhood, don't mess with a Vietnam vet growing up. That's because people didn't understand. They didn't understand what they had gone through and what they were going through. And so it's up to people like me who are able to say, well, you don't understand what they went through, and so you can't really understand the behavior until you do. Those conversations, sadly, are fewer and fewer. Talk about veterans groups going online. A lot of these conversations are inter-veteran conversations, and they need to be broadened to the general public because these people are fighting in our name. So we as Americans should have the at least emotional capacity to try and understand what they're going through. It's kind of incumbent upon us to make an effort. And I'll leave you with this. One of the recent events in our military history, the fall of Afghanistan. Having studied that, having looked at those images of people, trying to catch, to grab onto planes took me right back to things I had studied about the Vietnam War. So until you are able to make those emotional and historical connections, this divide is just going to get wider and wider, particularly as people rely more and more on online communications and not getting in the face and being able to make that emotional connection. It's really important, and there really needs to be more venues. Starting with the classroom is good, but there also needs to be more informal ways of kind of achieving, particularly after the pandemic, which has kind of thrust us all in different directions, making these connections and getting people to come closer together, literally.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I know we still have a number of very mission-driven vets in the room who have not had a chance to speak yet. Paul Sullivan, longtime advocate for fellow veterans with toxic exposure problems. Is the VA ready for an influx of PACT Act patients?
Can somebody get, or I'll,
Here. Am I going to?
Hi, Steve. Hello, my name is Paul Sullivan. That's a good question. The answer is, I hope so, and we'll find out real soon. Sometimes when you have to get up in front of a group and you didn't know that you were going to say anything until about 2 minutes before somebody calls your name, you have this process in your head go through, do I want them to remember what I said or how they felt when I was done? So this time I'm gonna go off with a little bit of a beer drinking angle. This all starts in a bar. You're like, why did the veteran go there? It's because in 1992, when I went into a VA looked at my DD-214 and it didn't say Gulf War on it. So they denied my care and they denied my claim. My DD-214, that's the discharge paper, said service in SWA. And I bet you there's only one person here who knows what that is, 2, 3, that knows what that is. And VA denied my care and benefits for 27 years. Wow. So back to 1992. A bunch of us Gulf War veterans who saw combat patches on our uniforms, we were tired of waiting in the VA. So what did we do? We went to a bar, okay? And after several beers and several other things, and I can't remember, it was 30 years ago, we decided to form the Gulf War Resource Center. We passed legislation that gave veterans 2 years of free care when they came home. We passed legislation that would require VA to do research on our toxic exposures. And we wanted VA to look into the mental health concerns of our veterans. We considered that a victory. What happened, though, is that VA just simply didn't have the money and didn't have the leadership to properly implement the bill. There were lots of other things going on at the same time. Next, let's go to another bar, okay? Fast forward to 2002. And the United States is making up stuff to invade Iraq a second time. So these same veterans who put together the Gulf War Resource Center put together Veterans for Common Sense in a bar. There were people from VFW there, people from the Legion there, people from Vietnam Veterans of America. And does anybody know who Bobby Mueller is? Okay, he's the guy that got caught shipping pot through the mail. But anyway, he's a friend of mine. What I'm trying to say is that the veterans got together over an issue that was impacting us. Delays in care and denials in care. And what we decided to do with VCS, Veterans for Common Sense, is we kept trying to tell VA, you don't have enough mental health care workers. You don't. You don't have enough people working on toxic wounds. So what did we do? We sued them. The result of the lawsuit was 5 years of free care for veterans, thanks to legislation. Then new regulations on PTSD. 500,000 claims granted right away. Suicide hotline. VA set that up. 7 million calls and texts. 250,000 veterans' lives saved. What's the bottom line out of these veterans going into a bar who were mad and upset? We wanted to make VA work. VA is a good place. We're telling veterans to go there, but VA has challenges. And every once in a while, you have to come up to him, sorry, Steve, he's my buddy, and kick him in the shins and let him know what's going on. We found out in that lawsuit that VA was deliberately concealing the cost of the war. And it was really disappointing. So that leads to the next thing, the cost of the war. Let me leave you with a couple of facts right here about the civilian-military divide. Our country has been at war for 32 years, 3 months, 1 week, and a couple of days. There are 4 open authorizations of the use of military force right now. And I go to Rotary clubs, just like Suzanne. I travel all over the country for my day job. There are people who don't know the country's at war. And it's absolutely amazing they don't. And that's why I'll get comments at a Rotary, wait, the war ended 30 years ago. What are you talking about? Hiring more VA doctors for more casualties. And I'll tell them, because of privatization of the military, the service members who go to the war zone are more likely to get shot at or shoot someone or have other trauma. A gentleman by the name of Colonel Hogue at Walter Reed published a seminal study on that in 2004. He showed that compared to World War II, people getting shot at and shooting other people was up. The stress was related to deployment to the war, not engaging in combat with the enemy. So what happened with that? 32 years of war, trillions of dollars. VA was focusing on physical medical problems. We get it. But there were some in VA who did not believe in the mental health consequences of war. If you Google God, Army, and PTSD, there was a political appointee who told me in his office that if veterans simply believed in Jesus, they would not have PTSD. I helped find that gentleman enough job. All right, that was part of the problem under the Bush administration. So I want to let folks know that when you're talking to civilians, let them know toxins are a serious problem, mental health is a serious problem. But let me wrap up with this. The PACT Act must truly be one of the most important pieces of legislation ever passed regarding VA, because it built on the Vietnam Veterans and Agent Orange, Gulf War illness. It added PACT Act. It threw in radiation from Palomares, Spain, and Tuelia, Greenland, and Enuitak out in the Central Pacific. So the PACT Act was huge in terms of expanding care for veterans, but all that came from veterans trying to kick VA in the shins to do better. What I'm really disappointed in is that there are right-wing groups out there right now that want to say that because of VA's problems, we either need to privatize it or shut it down. And that's not the right answer. The right answer is to fully fund VA, fully staff VA, all right? But it doesn't matter what happens. There's still going to be some veterans. They're going to want to go into a bar and try to figure out how to make VA better. But that's what we've got to do. We've got to make sure that the public knows VA is good, and to also, as you mentioned, Michaela, a minute ago, listen to their stories, because that's how we make all this work.
All right, we're almost out of time. Elliot, you had, in the back?
First, thank you all for hosting
coming.
this. Obviously, Mike Thompson couldn't be here, but he said he has to have representation in the room because he wants to hear all what's going on. He regularly meets with VSOs and other organizations because he, of course, is a Vietnam vet himself, combat veteran, and he supports many of the activities going on. And so I just wanted to say thank you all for hosting this. But I would definitely invite you all to come sit with us, sit down with Mr. Thompson, and express your concerns and issues, because he is always on top of these type of things. The PACT Act, when the other side did not want to push it forward, he was a huge advocate of it. When there was issues with TBI, he went and said, we need more funding for it. We need longer housing opportunities for Vietnam vets that are dealing with this. And he's done so many other things I can't talk about at all, but he has bills now that we're actually introducing, hopefully sometime soon, probably won't get it voted on this year, but he's going to keep reintroducing these bills and legislation because he knows how important it is to support our Vietnam vets and all veterans. And so I just want to say thank you all for hosting this. And just invite you all to please come talk to the boss, allow us to help you wherever we can. I know there's an issue with veterans experiencing homelessness now. For some reason it's going up. They're saying it's COVID related and there's other issues, but he's like, look, we got to fix this. We can't just keep allowing these things to happen. So here to support, come talk to the boss and we'll do more for you all.
Thank you.
Elliot, some final thoughts?
Elliot?
Richard. Oh, Richard, excuse me.
Yeah, I wanted to just make a technical correction to the point you made earlier. The AIR, the VA Asset and Infrastructure Review Commission, bill did not provide for any funding whatsoever for building new VA facilities. What it provided for was very cleverly worded. We spent a lot of time doing the legal analysis of it. What it provided for was that after the report was issued, the VA secretary, if it were ever issued, which of course it's not going to be, at least not in the current iteration, if a report was issued and it recommended closures, which it likely would, the VA secretary could immediately implement the closures. If it provided for recommendations for funding of new facilities, such facilities would have to be funded by Congress through regular appropriations process. So in other words, that's why we dubbed it the VA Closure Commission. The secretary would be able to administratively close anything that the commission recommended being closed, but could not build anything without a specific appropriation from Congress. And there was some squirrely language in there that suggested maybe he sort of could use some of the savings, but when we went through it, it was very clear there's case law on the point that he could not actually do that because that would involve use of an appropriation authority that Congress had not specifically authorized. So that's why we called it the VA Closure Commission. He could close, but he couldn't open.
Okay, we have a hand up from a representative from Senator Bernie Sanders' office, a longtime champion of veterans, former chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Issa Mattia.
How are you guys? Assam Mattia from Senator Sanders' office. I'm thank you for following and been big shoes to fill over here, Mr. Robinson. I also wanted to comment. Thank you for pointing out what you pointed out at the Air Commission. One of the things, to be frank, when I joined Senator Sanders' office, I didn't know a whole lot about the VA. I am a veteran though, and I use the VA. But in terms of policy, it was a very new subject matter to me. But I have become much more of a believer, in fact, a bit of an evangelist for this agency, because it is, in fact, an American institution and not just an institution for veterans. I think we have touched on the fact that they do enormous amounts of research. It's the second largest research institution in the country next to NIH. Most of it is far more groundbreaking than anybody in the private sector is doing. When we talk about quality of care, every study that has been done on VA, the quality of care is as good, if not better, than the private sector. When we talk about privatization and giving veteran choice, and I use air quotes because I think it's a pretty poor choice in most cases, we are talking about sending veterans to a place where they are almost guaranteed to wait longer for an appointment, where the federal government is going to pay more, in many cases double, if not more than that, for the care, and the care is going to be of lesser quality because the VA and because the private sector does not have nearly the same standards of quality of care that the Department of Veterans Affairs has. So one of the points that I would make is not only was the Air Commission extremely flawed because the Secretary already has the authority to do all of what the Air Commission was going to do. The Secretary can build establishments, hospitals, CBOCs as he chooses, the SCIP process, and the Secretary can close them as well. And not only the funding issue is obviously a problem.
Recommend closing facilities. You can't just close them.
Yeah, recommend, right. In closing, basically my point is that we need to, I think, make sure that the American people understand that this is actually an American healthcare issue and not just a veteran healthcare issue. And if the VA collapses and if the VA is privatized, we are going to have much larger issues for American healthcare at large.
Discussion in this room of discussions that need to happen all around the country. And, I think we have so many people in this room, and we need to get the message out to the American public. It's very interesting to me that Naveed is here as representative of Common Defense, and Jasper mentioned, you know, the image that we have of veterans is often sort of, I don't know, dangerous or whacked out or whatever. And I think, you know, one of the biggest problems is that the American media picks a very narrow scope of veterans to serve as sources of information. And, you know, folks like people in Common Defense or the whole bunch of veterans who are running for Congress and local office who are ignored, and we focus on, you know, the January 6th insurrectionists and whatever. So, I mean, this is also part of the civilian-military divide, but I mean, I think the conversation that is going on in this room that the Prospect has helped initiate and further is another way of bridging that divide. We can't allow that divide to continue. We can't allow the kind of ignorance about veterans, that government to continue. I would argue that the ignorance about veterans feeds the anti-government narrative that is so, you know, prevalent in this country, and that really needs to be, you know, needs to be attacked. If I hear another liberal say good enough for government work, you know, I think I'm gonna, like, you know, throw something at them, right? Because it's, so we really want to thank you for coming. We want to thank the Prospect, and we hope that we can continue this kind of dialogue in the future, and that this will be not the end of a discussion, but the beginning. We'd love to sell you our book, and we'd love to autograph our book to you, for you if you choose. This is going to be available as a recording.
It will probably be on the American Prospects YouTube page. It'll be available there. But we'll be sending out information about that as well to people who are RSVP. But
Yeah.
we'll get that information out.
So we hope that you will share, you know, the recording, and, you know, we just so value the expertise that's in this room, and your views and the kind of dialogue that we generated. I don't know if Jasper, do you want to say anything?
I'll just close and thank the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute, who's a co-sponsor of this event. As always, the Economic Policy Institute here in the building. And again, thank you to Steve, Suzanne, and Jasper. Their book is Our Veterans, Winners, Losers, Friends, and Enemies on the New Terrain of Veterans Affairs. Thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. Take care.